Good morning, everyone. Albert Einstein is frequently quoted as saying, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift." So the name of this service, The Physics of Harmony, got me thinking about something that's very interesting to me, which is the tension that arose between the worlds of art and science in the 19th century. Basically, the problem is this. At least at that time, artists thought to themselves, okay, so science is telling us that everything breaks down into smaller and smaller parts, and it's going into greater and greater detail about those parts. In addition, it seems to be claiming that these particles, corpuscles, are all that there is. The physical world is it, and there doesn't seem to be any meaning or purpose behind it. In addition, philosophy articulates a problem. For science and knowledge to be possible, causation has to be taken as a given. But if everything has a cause, what seems to follow is that any action taken by a human being is caused ultimately by forces over which he has no control. So it seems that we have to give up the notion of freedom of will. But wait, the romantics say. We're out here doing our own kind of science, a science of the spirit. It seems to us that we're going to great heights and depths never glimpsed before through our art, and it's also mysterious and magical. How could you ever categorize that? If you break it down in that way, the beauty seems to vanish, and we lose our freedom. What do you have to say about that? So as I was thinking about this service, I also got to thinking about deep history of this problem. I think it goes back thousands of years. Here's a thought process that I think would be common to a romantic artist. Imagine a young person, perhaps 3,200 years ago, lying in a field staring into a night sky. Maybe a Trojan youth, like late at night in the years before the conflict. I wonder what it is that he saw there, and how does it contrast with what we see today? Was he filled with wonder as we can be? Did he sit back and wonder what it all means? So actually, I think the answer is pretty simple. I think he was filled with wonder, but he might have answered no to the question if he wondered what it all meant. Meaning was one of the givens of his life. He didn't have to look for it. His life was bubbling over with it. To ask what something means is to be a separate knower. It is to be an individual. It is to admit of the possibility that meaning lies outside oneself, and that oneself is something one can talk about, apart from the tribe, the gods, and the ancestors. So when the young Trojan looked up at the sky, in addition to finding it beautiful and wondrous, he probably simply saw a continuation of everything else he knew and understood. And as he dozed off into dreams, his dreams, however fantastic and magical, would not have been so different from how he saw the world in waking life. Around 700 years after the Trojan War was supposed to have occurred, the ancient Greek philosophers began to ask questions just like what it all meant, and asking about first things. What does everything come down to, ultimately? And they set the groundwork with these kinds of questions for science as we know it today. I think you can pinpoint the beginnings of the problem I'm articulating to those centuries. I think the romantic sits back and wonders, what have we lost? To which a contemporary scientist may well respond, like diseases and stuff. It's not an accident that banishment was seen as one of the greatest punishments in ancient societies. To be separated and unseen, unknown, nothing could be more horrifying to an ancient person. But in a way, I think the romantics might have asked, in the modern world, is it possible that we have banished ourselves, removed the possibility of the deepest kind of life, even while we have gained immense knowledge and political freedom as individuals we would never want to go back on? So I have absolutely no idea what Max Bruch was thinking about when he wrote the nocturne that we're about to play. Use your imagination and your intuition. But I have no doubt that without the development of science as it transpired, the cultural movement within which he moved would very likely have been entirely different or not have happened at all. And I think their passions, questions, and strivings are just as important for us to consider today. Thank you.
When I volunteered to write a reflection about the special qualities of music through a scientific lens, I was hopeful that I would find an interesting angle I could focus on at reasonable length. Of course, as often happens with a subject like this, there turned out to be so much material I quickly became overwhelmed. So I've given up on trying to cover much of the range of material I found compelling and focus on a few, hopefully inspiring thoughts. My entry point to the subject was a 2006 book called This Is Your Brain on Music by Daniel Levitin, who started his career as a rock musician, became a music producer, and ultimately got a PhD and now studies music as a neuroscientist. While I found the book fascinating in many places, it left me with many more questions than answers. But then, were you used? What would we do if we had all the answers? One of the intriguing elements of this subject for me is how our brains respond to music, both listening to or actively making music. Levitin reports that the music stimulates an unusually large number of areas of the brain. For you armchair neuroanatomists, I know you're out there, this includes the brainstem, cerebellum, amygdala, and the frontal lobes. What's most striking about this list is that it includes both evolutionarily ancient parts that generate feelings and emotion, as well as the most modern analytical sections, all of whom contribute to the overall experience. For performing musicians, of course, parts of the brain that control movement are also triggered, such as motor cortex, as well as the sensory cortex, which provides feedback. For example, linking the pitch produced by a violin to the precise placement of fingers on a fretboard. One key piece of the response is the involvement of the hippocampus, where long-term memory is stored. Research backs up the personal experience of most of us that your musical preferences are largely set in late adolescence, when rapid cognitive development crashes headlong into powerful emotions and an intense need for group bonding. The memories formed listening to the music of that period make direct connections to vivid sensations and feelings that are activated when recalled much later in life. It is well established in studies with Alzheimer's and other dementia patients that they are able to access memories that are otherwise lost when music they listen to in their late teens and early 20s is played back to them. In my own personal experience, my mother, who recently turned 90 and suffers from a type of progressive memory loss, is uniquely soothed when we play her favorite classical pieces. One new area of research is the role of mirror neurons in music processing. Mirror neurons, you may be aware, are specialized cells triggered in motor areas of the brain when primates mentally mimic an activity they see another primate doing. This seems particularly relevant to musicians as they imagine themselves playing a piece while watching and listening to someone else perform. But it may be a more general phenomenon given humans' innate senses of rhythm and pitch. While the field is still young and hard data is sparse, researchers have proposed a model where the mirror neuron system is a key part of the pathway from listening and seeing music performed to an emotional response to the music. They propose that this process is linked to a feeling of empathy with the performers. This then leads to the shared experience of listening to or performing music and how this amplifies feelings and creates group cohesion. This is a profound effect of music, particularly when combined with dance, and it's directly relevant to our own joyful experience of singing and performing together here at UUCR. A recent example of the strength of a collective musical event was reported by Seattle area seismologists. They could tell when Taylor Swift performed Shake It Off at her concert. At a local stadium, the audience response measured 2.3 on the Richter scale. For me, even with my very amateur musical skills, rehearsing and performing music as part of a group is a uniquely fulfilling experience. Particularly when playing a complicated piece, whether it's an unusual chord progression or a highly syncopated jazz rhythm, there's a tremendous satisfaction to immersing yourself in the group dynamic and hopefully staying in sync. As more than one community band member, band director has said, as long as we start together and finish together, you can commit murder in between. One could call the experience spiritual, but for me that word doesn't really capture the feeling. To me, it feels more like losing myself, perhaps in a Buddhist sense, at least temporarily subsuming the ego and intellect to a more intuitive mental state. So while I can't resist learning as much as I can about the science behind our appreciation of music, ultimately I trust my curiosity will never reduce my joy in the experience, particularly when performing it in a group. And I hope that's true for you as well. For my closing words, sometimes life provides just what you need, just when you need it. Lydia Polgreen, in a recent New York Times piece, quoted Emily Saliers of the Indigo Girls. The songs I grew up loving, they're not just something I listen to, they become cellular. They encode life events that become memories. I'm sure it boils down to physics in some way, but it feels quite mystical to me.
I'll start with a question. Why are you so bad at singing hymns? The answer, we are always reading ahead to see if we agree with the words. We UUs come from a wide range of backgrounds. Most of us were not raised in UU congregations. I will remind you that the original English and American Unitarians of the 19th century were liberal Christians who just didn't believe in the Trinity. Today, we probably have Trinitarians in our congregation. Well, our variety of beliefs were a problem for those who put together this gray hymnal, which was published in 1993. The hymn we just sang, Holy, 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 which we rarely sing, is definitely a liberal Christian hymn. It was written in the early 1800s by an Anglican bishop who wrote it specifically for Trinity Sunday, which is the 8th Sunday after Easter. The hymn tune was written by another English clergyman later in the 19th century, and appropriately, the name of the tune, you probably didn't notice that every tune in the Gray Hymnal has a name, is Nicaea, which is a very appropriate, refers to the First Council of Nicaea in the year 325, when Emperor Constantine wanted everybody to agree on the exact theology of Christianity. The Trinitarians won. The Unitarians lost, but they weren't called Unitarians at the time. Well, the original words of Holy, Holy, Holy aren't too appropriate for UUs with our variety of beliefs. The first line of the original is, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. Not so good for humanists, agnostics, atheists, pantheists, polytheists, pagans, and so on. And the fourth line of the original first verse is, God in three persons, Holy Trinity. Some of you nodding remember singing that. I sang it as a Methodist. So the words of our hymnals, many of them have been changed. The small print, it says arranged. They don't say who did it and when. For instance, the fourth line is we sang Holy, 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 author of creation, not the original. Well, I'm a scientist, a physicist by training. I believe in evidence, and I don't see any evidence that there is an author of the creation, an eternal author. It's also true that I don't see any evidence that there isn't such an author of creation. In fact, scientists today have no idea of why there is a universe. We know it began as a big bang nearly 14 million years ago, creator or no creator. 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth was formed out of stuff that was floating around, debris from dead stars. And life eventually happened, and eventually humans happened. Well, I do like the hymn, Holy, 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 though I don't agree with the theology. The original is actually better. It's 4 verses instead of 3, and all the verses have the E rhyme at the end. So, what's a UU to do? Similarly, I do like our opening hymn, Morning Has Broken. That's from 1931. I remember 1971 Cat Stevens singing that. It was a big hit back then. But morning has broken like the first morning. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. That clearly refers to Genesis, the first book of Genesis. There was a first morning. There was a first bird. And the last line of the first verse, praise for them springing fresh from the word. That clearly refers to the gospel according to John, who was heavily influenced by Greek philosophy in the latter part of the first century. Remember the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So, what's a you to do? Our closing hymn, which we will sing, but not now, is another that I sang in my Methodist youth. It has the refrain in our book, source of all to thee we raise, this our hymn of grateful praise. The original, which also comes from the 1860s, had Lord of all. What is the source of all? Is it some deity that wants our praise? Or is it the laws of physics and chemistry and biology? Or are we supposed to think of this as some poetic metaphor not to be taken literally? So what's a you to do? Those of us who don't believe in a god or gods can think poetically, metaphorically, and still sing the same words. Those of us who do believe in a god or gods can think more literally and still sing the same words. The same applies to our other hymn, Spirit of Life, written in 1981 by Carolyn McDade. It's the hymn that we sing most often. Well, Spirit of Life is vague. A sign of its vagueness is that the Spanish words don't say Spirit of Life, they say Fountain of Love. Well, as long as we don't spell out what Spirit of Life or Fountain of Life mean, we can sing the words. It's vague, maybe undefined, it's poetry, it's mystery, it's mysticism, it's spiritual, or something like that. Whichever way, it's fine with me.